Have you ever noticed how heavy a thought can be? It weighs nothing on a scale, yet it can feel like you are carrying a mountain on your shoulders. It keeps you awake. It keeps you tight. It keeps you from the peace you deserve. I'm glad you're here. If you are listening to this, it's likely that your day has been long, or your mind is busy. Perhaps you are replaying conversations, worrying about tomorrow, or simply feeling a tension you can't quite name. That is okay. You don't need to force it to stop. And if you feel like it, you can gently let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Sometimes, it's comforting to realize how many of us are quietly sharing this same moment from different corners of the world. You see, the mind is like a guardian dog. It barks at shadows because it wants to protect you. We don't need to yell at the dog to be quiet. We just need to gently let it know that we are safe, so it can lay its head down and rest. For the next hour, I am going to share a collection of stories with you. These aren't just fairy tales. They are mirrors. Some are from the Zen tradition, some from Stoic philosophy, and some are simple metaphors for the human experience. Each story revolves around two things: the art of letting go and the discovery of your inner strength. You don't need to memorize these stories. You don't even need to listen to every word. If you drift off to sleep in the middle of a sentence, that is perfect. That is the goal. Think of my voice as a gentle breeze. You can enjoy it while it's there, but you don't need to hold on to it. Get comfortable now. Adjust your pillows. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Unclench your jaw. Let's begin with our first journey, a journey about the weight we choose to carry. By the time the kitchen quiets down, their hands are still moving. Not fast anymore, just out of habit, guided by muscle memory that doesn't immediately understand that the rush is over. The last pan has been scrubbed, the counters wiped, the burners turned off one by one. But their body hasn't fully caught up yet. They stand at the stainless steel table under the dim backlight, looking at what's left. A plate sits in front of them, heavier than it should be, crowded with food that was never meant for one person. Portions added without thinking, extra scoops, a little more here, a little more there. Not because anyone asked, but because that's what they always do. Give more than necessary. Fill every gap. Make sure no one leaves wanting. They pick up a spoon and hesitate. All day their job is to keep things moving, to make sure everyone gets fed, satisfied, taken care of. There is comfort in that rhythm, in being useful in such a clear, measurable way. Plates come back empty. People don't complain. The system works. But at the end of the night, when the noise drains out of the room and only the low hum of the fridge remains, something else becomes visible. The overflow. They scrape the extra food gently into a container, the sound soft but distinct metal against ceramic. The plate underneath slowly reappears, its edges finally visible, clean and plain. It feels strange to stop before it's completely full again. For a long time, they believed generosity meant filling every available space. If there was room, they filled it. If there was silence, they spoke. If someone seemed unsure, they stepped in. Saying no felt like waste, like selfishness. like letting something good go unused. But lately, exhaustion has been creeping in, quiet but persistent, settling into their shoulders and lower back, following them home even after the shift ends. No amount of sleep seems to fully touch it. They cap the container and set it aside, noticing how light the plate feels now. There's still food on it. Enough. Just not excessive. They sit down on a stool nearby and look at it for a moment longer than necessary, as if waiting for a feeling of guilt to arrive. It doesn't. Not exactly. Instead, there's a mild discomfort, the kind that comes when you do something unfamiliar, even if it's kinder. Their mind reaches automatically for old rules. You should give more. Someone else might need it. You can handle it. Those thoughts don't shout. They whisper. They remember learning those rules slowly over years. Praised for being accommodating, thanked for being dependable, noticed most when they went a little past their limit. No one ever said, "You must empty yourself to be worthy." But the lesson still landed. They take a bite from the plate, tasting the food properly for the first time tonight. It's warm, simple grounding. Eating slowly feels almost rebellious, like stepping out of line when no one is watching. As they chew, they realize how often they treat themselves like an afterthought. Leftovers, rushed moments, whatever time remains after everyone else is satisfied. They glance at the container again. The overflow hasn't disappeared. It's just been set aside. And something about that feels important. Maybe giving doesn't always mean pouring everything out. Maybe it means knowing when the cup is already full. They finish the bite and rest their hands in their lap, noticing how their shoulders drop a fraction, how their breathing settles without effort. The kitchen feels different now, less like a place of output and more like a place that's allowed to be quiet. They don't come to any conclusions. They don't promise to change everything tomorrow. They simply sit with the plate in front of them, learning the shape of enough, realizing for the first time how long it's been since they allowed themselves to stop before crossing the line into depletion. And in that pause, something begins to soften, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to suggest that maybe what they've been calling generosity has been asking for a small correction. Not less care, just better balance. They don't rush to clean up. Normally, the moment they finish eating, their body would already be halfway back into motion, stacking dishes, wiping surfaces, preparing for whatever comes next. Tonight, they let the plate sit where it is unfinished, but no longer overwhelming. The kitchen feels different when there is no urgency. The low hum of the refrigerator fills the space, steady and patient, as if reminding them that things can continue without constant effort. They lean back slightly on the stool and let their feet rest flat on the floor, grounding themselves in the simple fact of being here. They think about how often they've equated self-worth with output. If they give more, they matter more. If they carry the extra load, they belong. If they never complain, they're appreciated. These beliefs weren't forced on them. They grew quietly, shaped by small moments of approval and relief, by the subtle comfort of being needed. Over time, giving stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like an obligation. But obligation, they are beginning to notice, has a different texture than care. Care feels warm, intentional, alive. Obligation feels tight, mechanical, draining. They look at the plate again, at the clear boundary where the food ends and the ceramic begins. That boundary feels symbolic in a way they wouldn't have expected. It's not a rejection. It's a definition. Enough has edges. For so long they believed that boundaries made things smaller, that limits reduced what was possible. But sitting here now, they sense the opposite. The boundary is what allows the meal to be enjoyed, the body to relax, the moment to be fully lived. They remember times when they gave from emptiness, when generosity felt more like sacrifice than kindness. Those moments came with resentment. They didn't want to admit fatigue. They pushed through, and a quiet hope that someone would notice how much they were carrying. Tonight there is no audience, and in that absence, a different kind of honesty becomes possible. They place their hand over their stomach and notice the subtle signals their body has been sending all along. Full doesn't mean uncomfortable. Rested doesn't mean lazy. Stopping doesn't mean failing. These truths feel simple, almost obvious, and yet they have been ignored for years. They gather the plate and stand moving with an ease that wasn't there earlier. The container of extra food remains on the counter, closed, waiting. Not wasted, just not consumed right now. Giving from overflow, they realize, doesn't require depletion. It requires patience. They rinse the plate and set it on the rack, the sound of water gentle, unhurried. Each movement feels less like a task and more like a continuation of the care they've been offering all day, only now it includes themselves. Before turning off the light, they pause and look around the kitchen one last time. Nothing has changed on the surface. The room is the same. The work will begin again tomorrow. But something internal has shifted. They no longer feel the need to prove their value by how much they can hold or how much they can give away. The sense of worth they're touching now feels steadier, quieter, and far less fragile. It doesn't ask them to empty themselves. It simply asks them to notice when the cup is full, and to trust that keeping what they need is not a betrayal of generosity, but the very thing that makes it sustainable. They turn off the light and step out of the kitchen, carrying that understanding with them, not as a rule, not as a promise, but as a gentle recalibration. From now on, they don't need to give everything. They only need to give what truly comes from abundance. She notices the draft before she notices the noise. It slips in through the small gap beneath the back door, barely strong enough to move the curtain, but enough to brush against her ankles as she stands in the kitchen. The room is dim, lit only by the soft yellow bulb above the sink and the faint glow of the streetlight outside the window. She sets her bag down on the counter and exhales long and slow, the way people do when they're trying to leave the day behind without fully knowing how. Her shoulders feel tight, like they've been holding something upright for hours. Outside, a car passes. Somewhere down the block, someone laughs too loudly, the sound sharp in the quiet. Her phone buzzes once, then again, resting face up on the counter as if it has something important to say. She doesn't look at it yet. Instead, she opens a drawer and takes out a small candle. It's nothing special, just one she picked up months ago and never used. She sets it near the sink, pushes aside a dish towel, and strikes a match. The flame catches with a quick, dry sound, then steadies thin and upright. For a moment, it holds perfectly still. Then the draft reaches it. The flame bends slightly, leaning to one side, its shape changing with every faint movement of air. It doesn't go out, but it doesn't stand straight either. It wavers, adjusting again and again. She watches it longer than she expects to. Her phone buzzes once more. This time she glances at the screen. A message preview, a headline. Someone's opinion delivered quickly and without invitation. Her chest tightens in response, the familiar pull to read, to respond, to explain. She turns the phone face down. The flame flickers again, reacting instantly to the shift in air as she moves. It doesn't resist. It doesn't complain. It simply responds moment by moment, doing what flames do to stay alive. She leans against the counter, arms crossed loosely, eyes fixed on the candle. The day has been full of voices, meetings, conversations layered with expectations, advice given freely, sometimes kindly, sometimes not. Even now, alone in her kitchen, the noise hasn't stopped. It hums quietly inside her, replaying comments, imagining responses, anticipating what someone might think next. She tells herself she should be used to this by now. Careers, relationships, daily life, all of it comes with opinions. You learn to handle it. You learn to listen selectively. At least that's what she's always believed. But watching the candle, she notices something she hasn't thought about before. The flame isn't trying to block the wind. It isn't fighting it. And yet it isn't letting the wind define it either. When the draft grows stronger, the flame bends lower, shrinking its shape, conserving itself. When the air stills, it rises again, bright and steady. She feels something soften in her chest. Her phone buzzes again, more insistently this time. A new message. Another voice asking for attention. She picks it up, reads just enough to know it will pull her into a familiar spiral if she lets it. She doesn't respond. Instead, she reaches for the door and presses it closed more firmly, feeling the latch catch with a soft click. The draft weakens immediately. The flame straightens its light, growing calmer, more contained. She hadn't realized how much air had been moving through the room. She sits down at the small kitchen table, the candle between her and the sink, and rests her hands in her lap. The silence isn't complete. The refrigerator hums. The building settles. The city breathes beyond the walls. But something important has shifted. For a long time, she's believed that peace comes from managing everything outside her. From responding quickly. From correcting misunderstandings before they grow. From staying alert to every change in tone. Now sitting here, she sees how exhausting that has been. The flame doesn't ask the wind to stop. It simply adjusts its own shape and relies on the space immediately around it. When the space is calmer, the flame thrives without effort. She thinks about how often she's left her own doors open, letting every opinion rush in, believing it's her responsibility to stay exposed. The candle burns quietly, its wax beginning to pool at the base. Nothing dramatic happens. No realization crashes through her. Just a gentle awareness settling into place. She doesn't need to put herself out to survive the noise. She watches the flame a little longer, letting its steady presence anchor her attention, and for the first time all evening, her mind stops racing ahead to the next thing that might disturb her. She doesn't blow the candle out. That thought crosses her mind for a moment, the way it often does when something feels slightly overwhelming. Ending it would be simple. One breath and the light would disappear. Instead, she reaches for a small glass bowl from the counter and turns it upside down, placing it near the flame without covering it. The glass catches the light, reflecting it back softly, changing the way the shadows move along the wall. The candle burns on calmer now, less reactive to the faint movements of air in the room. She leans back in her chair and lets her hands rest on the table. The position feels unfamiliar, like she's no longer bracing herself for something. Her shoulders lower, and the space between her thoughts begins to widen, not because she's trying to quiet her mind, but because there's less to react to. Her phone vibrates again. She doesn't flinch this time. She reaches for it slowly, as if testing how much attention it actually deserves. The screen lights up. Another message, another opinion, another small demand for response. She reads it once, then sets the phone down a little farther away, out of easy reach. Nothing in the room changes. The candle doesn't flicker in protest. The walls don't close in. The night continues indifferent to her decision. She realizes how often she's treated every notification like a gust of wind she has to face head on. Every message, every comment, every reaction has felt like something she must answer immediately, as if her calm depended on staying engaged. But watching the candle now, she sees that calm isn't something you defend by standing exposed. It's something you protect by choosing how much air you let in. She gets up and turns off the kitchen light, leaving only the candle's glow. The room softens instantly, edges blurring just enough to feel gentle. The shadows deepen, but they don't feel threatening. They feel like rest. She sits back down and lets her eyes follow the small movements of the flame. Even sheltered, it still shifts slightly, responding to the subtle currents of the room. It isn't frozen. It isn't rigid. It's alive, adjusting without panic. That feels important. For a long time, she's believed that being strong meant staying open to everything, taking it all in, enduring the noise, proving she could handle it. But that strength has often come at the cost of her own steadiness. Now she sees another kind of strength taking shape. It's quieter, less impressive. It doesn't argue or explain. It simply chooses where to stand. She thinks about the conversations she's replayed in her head, the ones she wishes had gone differently. The comments that linger longer than they should. The imagined judgments that follow her home even when no one is actually speaking. They still exist. She knows that. The world hasn't softened just because she has. But they feel farther away now, like sounds from another room with the door gently closed. She exhales slow and full, and feels the tension drain from her neck. The candle's light reflects in the glass bowl, doubling and then softening, as if the flame has found a way to rest without disappearing. She doesn't promise herself she'll always protect her peace this way. She doesn't turn it into a rule or a resolution. She knows there will be days when the doors are left open again, when the wind rushes in and the flame wavers. Tonight doesn't need to solve every other night. It only needs to be this one. She sits there until the wax has melted further, until the flame has settled into a steady, patient burn. The phone remains silent on the counter, not because the world has stopped talking, but because she has stopped inviting it so close. When she finally stands to blow the candle out, she does it gently with intention. The smoke rises in a thin, quiet line, then fades into the air. The room darkens, but it doesn't feel empty. It feels protected. Some bursts of anger arrive so fast that we don't even realize we're angry yet. A brief interruption, an unexpected movement, a tiny sense of being crossed, and suddenly the chest tightens, the hands clench, and the mind starts building a story. We believe someone did something wrong, that someone deserves blame. But sometimes what we collide with is just an empty boat. Jason was 23, a senior in college, still getting used to driving on the freeway every day. That night, he left the library later than planned. It was fully dark now, streetlights stretching ahead like an endless stream of light. Jason turned on his signal, merged into traffic, and tried to keep just enough distance so he wouldn't have to brake hard. A car in front of him suddenly cut into his lane. No signal, no warning. Jason jolted his foot, hitting the brake harder than necessary. His heart jumped. A familiar rush of heat surged up. What kind of driving is that? The thought flashed through his mind before anything else could. He gripped the steering wheel, eyes locked on the car ahead. For a few short seconds, Jason's world shrank down to that one vehicle. He imagined the driver's face, imagined carelessness, imagined disrespect. With each image, the anger sharpened a little more. Then traffic slowed. The space between cars widened. Jason's breathing slowed with it without him trying. As the red glow of brake lights reflected across the windshield, he noticed how tightly he was holding the wheel. His fingers had gone pale. His shoulders were raised higher than usual. He loosened his grip just a little, not to forgive anyone, just because his hands were tired. And in that very small moment, another thought slipped in. What if there was no one in that car to be angry at? What if it had simply drifted across without intention, without malice, without aiming at him at all? That thought didn't erase the anger right away, but it interrupted the story in Jason's head, like speaking quickly and suddenly forgetting the next word. There was a gap, and in that gap, he noticed something. He was angry at an image his own mind had created. The car ahead kept going. It didn't look back. It didn't react. There was no sign it knew what Jason was thinking. Maybe the driver was exhausted. Maybe distracted by something else. Maybe it was just a moment of carelessness, or maybe there was nothing to it at all, just two paths crossing briefly, then moving on. Jason looked at the flow of cars around him. Each one had lights. Each one was moving. But he knew nothing about the people inside. He didn't know what kind of day they'd had, what they were carrying in their minds, or whether someone among them was angry at him for something equally small. He breathed in, then out. Not deep, not long. Just enough for the tightness in his chest to ease. The heat didn't spread anymore. It was still there, but it wasn't growing like a fire, no longer being fed. There was an old story Jason remembered from a life skills class about a boat drifting on a river. When two boats collide, if you see the other boat is empty, you don't get angry. But if you believe someone is steering it, anger rises immediately. Not because of the collision itself, but because of the idea that someone did this to you. Jason didn't think of it as a lesson. He just felt it happening right now on this road in his own body. The lane change was already over, but the anger had only just begun, and now it was beginning to slow. He turned on the radio, then turned it off right away. The sound wasn't needed. Tonight, the steady engine noise and the slow flow of lights were enough. Jason let the car move with traffic, no faster, no slower, just staying in his lane. Sometimes we don't need to win a moment. We don't need someone else to admit fault. We just need to see that what we ran into might not have had anyone there to be angry at in the first place. And if that's true, why keep holding the anger at all? Jason kept driving, freeway lights stretching out ahead. The story in his head was no longer racing. It had settled, giving way to a strange but comfortable space. Traffic gradually thinned as Jason exited the freeway. The smaller roads leading back to his neighborhood were much quieter, streetlights spaced farther apart, their light falling in short patches across the asphalt. The alertness from earlier was gone. His hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, not gripping just enough to keep the car steady. The anger had slipped somewhere behind him now, like a car that had taken a different turn. It hadn't disappeared completely. It just wasn't right in front of him anymore. When it no longer had to be watched, it naturally began to lose its sharp edges. Jason noticed his breathing had evened out. Not because he was trying to calm down, but because there was no longer a story to keep running. No one needed to be right. No one needed to be wrong. There was only the road opening ahead and the ordinary movement of driving home. He stopped at an intersection. Red light, yellow, green. The changes happened steadily, indifferent to the mood of anyone waiting. Jason watched the colors shift and felt something inside him shift too slowly without being pushed. When he pulled up in front of his apartment, he turned off the engine but didn't get out right away. Not because he was thinking about anything, just because this moment was calm enough to stay in for a few extra seconds. The metal cooled. The space around the car closed in like a small cocoon. Jason opened the door and stepped out. The night air was cooler, brushing lightly against his skin. He locked the car, heard the short beep, and walked away. He didn't look back at the road he had just traveled. There was no need. Inside the small room, he turned on the desk lamp. The soft yellow light was gentle enough not to fully wake him up. Jason set his keys on the table and dropped his backpack on the floor. Everything landed where it belonged, without needing adjustment. There was a quiet comfort in realizing that not every moment requires a reaction. He washed his hands, the water running steadily, a familiar feeling. The water carried away road dust, fatigue, and the faint leftover trace of anger. Jason let it run a few seconds longer, then turned off the faucet. No ritual. Just the end of an action. When he lay down on the bed, he didn't think about the other car anymore. He didn't think about himself in that moment either. The images had lost their weight. They didn't need to be held onto to prove anything. Some collisions don't need to be carried all the way to the end of the day. Jason turned onto his side, finding his usual position. The blanket came up to his shoulders. The room was quiet with no sudden sounds. And he noticed something very simple. Anger needs an object to hold on to. When the object dissolves, anger has nowhere left to cling. The empty boat had passed long ago. The river kept flowing. Nothing was broken. Nothing needed fixing. There had only been a moment that ended and a body that didn't need to keep carrying it. Jason closed his eyes. He didn't force himself to sleep. He let his eyes rest. His breath moved in and out, steady and light. No intention, no plan, no reaction required. If more collisions come tomorrow, that's okay. We don't always remember that the boat might be empty, but tonight, just having seen it once was enough for his body to relearn what it feels like not to be angry. The room settled into silence. No conclusion, no reminder, just a slow current guiding everything back to its place. And within that current, sleep arrived very gently, as if it had been there all along, simply waiting until no one was colliding with anyone anymore. By the time the shift ended, their body already knew it had been holding too much. It wasn't one sharp moment or a single bad interaction. It was the accumulation of small things, stacked quietly on top of one another the way water gathers behind a dam, long before anyone notices the pressure building. They walked down the hospital corridor toward the locker room, the fluorescent lights humming overhead in a steady, indifferent rhythm. The hallway was nearly empty now, just the soft squeak of shoes on polished floors and the distant beeping of a machine somewhere behind closed doors. Their shoulders felt tight. Their neck ached in that dull, familiar way that came from bracing without realizing it. All day they had moved quickly, spoken calmly, absorbed frustration that didn't belong to them, and kept going. That was part of the job. What no one talked about was what happened to all of that feeling once it had nowhere else to go. Inside the locker room, they set their bag down and leaned against the cool metal bench. For a moment, they just stood there, breathing, noticing how shallow each breath felt, like it didn't quite reach the bottom of their lungs. Something inside them wanted to burst, not in anger, not in tears, just in release. They twisted the cap off their water bottle, and the small crack echoed softly in the quiet room. The sound caught their attention, sharp and clear, like the beginning of something opening. They took a long drink, then another, letting the coolness travel down slowly instead of rushing it. Even that simple act felt intentional, like a small permission to pause. As they sat down, their mind returned to the moment that had tipped everything just a little too far. A comment made in passing, a look that dismissed rather than acknowledged, a feeling of being expected to absorb it and move on as if nothing had landed. They had done that, of course. They always did. But now, away from the noise and urgency, the weight of it pressed more clearly against their chest. They pictured it suddenly, without trying to. A dam. Strong. Necessary. holding back an entire river so life downstream could continue uninterrupted. The structure wasn't the problem. The problem was what happened when there was no release. They had been taught to be that dam, to hold, to contain, to stay intact no matter how much built up behind the walls. What no one emphasized enough was the importance of the spillway. They reached into their bag and pulled out a small notebook, the kind they kept for grocery lists and reminders. It wasn't meant for emotions, but that almost made it better. There was no pressure to be eloquent, no expectation of insight. They flipped to a blank page and stared at it. For a few seconds, nothing came. Then slowly they wrote a single sentence. "I'm angry that I wasn't listened to." The words looked plain on the page, almost too simple to carry the weight they felt inside. But as soon as the sentence existed outside of them, something shifted. Their chest loosened a fraction, their jaw unclenched without being told. They wrote another line. "I'm tired of being calm when I don't feel calm." The pen moved steadily now, not fast, not rushed. Each sentence felt like opening a small gate, letting a controlled amount of water move through instead of pushing harder against the walls. They didn't blame. They didn't accuse. They didn't justify. They simply named what was there. By the time they closed the notebook, their breathing had deepened. The pressure hadn't vanished, but it no longer felt dangerous. It had somewhere to go. They stood up, slung their bag over their shoulder, and walked toward the exit. The night air outside was cool against their face, grounding in a way that felt immediate and real. As they headed to their car, they noticed something important. They weren't numb. They weren't flooded. They were balanced. The dam was still standing, but the water was no longer threatening to break it. The drive home was quieter than usual, not because there was nothing to think about, but because the pressure had already eased just enough to make space. The road stretched ahead under the glow of streetlights, each one passing in a steady rhythm like a metronome, guiding their breath back into something slower and more natural. They noticed how different their body felt compared to other nights. Usually, this was the moment when everything they had held in all day would start banging against the inside of their chest, demanding attention all at once. Tonight it stayed calmer, as if it trusted that it would be heard again if needed. At a red light, they rested their hands on the steering wheel and felt how relaxed their grip was. Their shoulders weren't hunched, their jaw wasn't locked. That small notebook sat on the passenger seat, closed now, unremarkable, but its presence mattered. It was proof that the feelings didn't have to stay trapped inside to be controlled. At home, they moved through the door quietly, setting their bag down and slipping off their shoes. The apartment was dim, the kind of soft darkness that invites you to slow down instead of rush. They went to the kitchen and poured another glass of water, listening to it hit the bottom of the glass with a clear, gentle sound. As they drank, they thought about how often anger gets misunderstood. People talk about it as something explosive, something dangerous that must be suppressed or avoided at all costs. But what they had felt all day wasn't an explosion. It was pressure. And pressure doesn't disappear by being ignored. They sat at the small table and let their thoughts drift without pushing them in any direction. The moments from earlier surfaced again, but this time without the sharp edges. They could see the situation more clearly now, not because it had changed, but because they weren't drowning in it. That was when forgiveness began to make sense in a new way. Not as an act of generosity towards someone else, not as a sudden release of understanding, but as a commitment to maintenance. Just like a dam needs regular controlled release to stay strong, they needed a way to let feelings move through without destroying anything in the process. They didn't need to confront anyone tonight. They didn't need to explain themselves perfectly. They didn't even need an apology. They just needed to keep the spillway open. Later, as they prepared for bed, they noticed how easily their bodies settled. There was no restless pacing, no urge to replay conversations or rehearse what they might say next time. The water had already been released. As they lay down, the thought came quietly, without weight. Forgiveness isn't about letting everything go at once. It's about letting a little go often enough that nothing breaks. Their breathing slowed. The day loosened its grip. What had felt heavy and overwhelming hours earlier now felt manageable, contained, and far less personal. The dam held. The river flowed. Nothing collapsed. And in that balance, sleep arrived naturally, without force, without resistance, carrying them into rest, the way water moves when it's finally allowed to follow its path. The library sounds different after closing. Not silent exactly, but softened, as if every noise has learned to lower its voice out of respect. The air system hums gently overhead, steady and even, and somewhere in the distance, a cartwheel clicks once, then settles. She sits at one of the long wooden tables near the back, the kind meant for quiet reading, not conversation. A small desk lamp casts a warm circle of light over the open book in front of her, leaving the rest of the room in shadow. She turns a page slowly. The paper makes a soft, dry sound, barely noticeable, but it feels grounding. All day people move through the library carrying questions, needs, and stories that don't belong to her, but somehow linger anyway. She helps them find what they're looking for, smiles politely, listens carefully. By the time the doors lock for the night, she feels full in a way that isn't nourishing. She presses her thumb gently against the edge of the page and pauses, not because the sentence is difficult, but because something in her chest has tightened again. It happens often quietly, without warning. Being open has always been part of who she is. People sense it quickly. They lean in, share more than they planned, trust her with pieces of themselves they haven't organized yet. She doesn't push them away. She knows how much courage that kind of sharing takes. But lately, she's begun to notice how porous she feels, as if there are no walls between her inner world and everyone else's. The lamp flickers faintly, then steadies. She exhales and lets her shoulders drop just a little. The room doesn't react. Nothing collapses when she stops holding herself so carefully. She looks up from the book and lets her eyes travel across the shelves, row after row of spines, each one holding a story that knows where it begins and where it ends. Boundaries, she thinks, Stories are allowed to have them. Somewhere along the way, she learned that kindness meant accessibility, always available, always understanding, always willing to absorb what others couldn't carry alone. No one ever told her she had to do this. But the pattern formed anyway, reinforced by gratitude and relief, by the quiet praise that comes when you don't say no. She closes the book gently and rests her hands on the cover. The title doesn't matter. What matters is the feeling of containment, of something held safely between two firm edges. She wonders when she stopped believing she deserved the same. The idea of a sanctuary comes to her suddenly, not a physical place, but an inner one. A space untouched by expectation, where no explanations are required and no stories need to be processed or understood. A place where nothing can be taken. The thought feels both comforting and unfamiliar. She has always been good at creating safe spaces for others. Reading corners, quiet tables, gentle rules that protect silence without announcing themselves. But for herself, she has relied on endurance. She pushes her chair back slightly and stands, stretching her arms overhead in a slow, careful motion. The movement releases a subtle ache she didn't realize she was carrying. Her body responds immediately, grateful for the attention. As she lowers her arms, she imagines drawing a line not around her body, but within it. A boundary that doesn't harden her, doesn't make her distant, just defines where she ends and others begin. The idea doesn't feel selfish. It feels sane. She walks between the shelves, fingertips brushing lightly along the spines as she passes. Each book stays where it belongs. None of them spill into the next. None of them apologize for taking up space. She stops near the window and looks out at the dark street beyond the glass. The world continues on its own rhythm, indifferent to whether she is open or closed, giving or resting. For the first time all day, she feels a quiet permission settle in. Not to withdraw from life, not to become unreachable, but to protect something small and essential inside herself. A place no one else enters. Not because it's hidden, but because it's sacred. She turns away from the window and walks back toward the table. Her steps slow, unhurried, as if the library itself has adjusted to match her pace. The chair makes a soft sound as she pulls it out again, familiar and grounding. And she sits without opening the book this time. Instead, she rests her hands on the table and notices their warmth. For so long, she believed that being kind meant being open in every direction, like a room with no doors, no walls, no way to close anything off. She thought strength was the ability to stay exposed without flinching, to remain available, no matter how much passed through her. But exposure, she is learning, is not the same as openness. Openness has choice. Exposure does not. The distinction feels subtle but important, like the difference between offering a seat and giving away the whole room. She leans back slightly and lets her gaze soften, no longer focused on any one thing. The quiet wraps around her, not as emptiness, but as presence. The library has always been a place where voices lower themselves naturally, where urgency dissolves into something more patient. She wonders why she hasn't allowed herself to internalize that same rule. Inside her, there has always been a space she never named, a place she rarely visited, because she didn't think she was allowed to linger there. It's the part of her that doesn't explain, doesn't justify, doesn't make sense of pain for anyone else's comfort. A place that doesn't answer questions. Tonight, she lets herself imagine stepping into it. There are no shelves there, no words waiting to be arranged. Just a stillness that doesn't feel empty, but intact. Nothing is broken. Nothing needs to be fixed. She feels her breath slow without effort. Protecting this space, she realizes, doesn't mean closing her heart. It means refusing to let every feeling become public property. It means understanding that some things are meant to be held, not shared, not processed aloud, not softened for others. She has spent years translating herself into something digestible. Tonight she stops. The decision doesn't arrive as a declaration. It's quieter than that. More like a gentle internal shift, a subtle repositioning of weight. She doesn't vow to change how she shows up in the world tomorrow. She doesn't rehearse boundaries or imagine difficult conversations. She simply recognizes that there is a part of her that does not need permission to exist. That part is already whole. She stands and turns off the desk lamp, letting the room settle into deeper shadow. The darkness doesn't feel threatening. It feels protective, like a cover drawn gently over something precious. As she walks toward the exit, she notices how her body feels lighter. Not because anything has been resolved, but because something has been released. The constant vigilance, the quiet readiness to receive whatever comes next, has loosened its grip. At the door, she pauses and looks back once more at the long rows of shelves disappearing into the dim light. Each book remains exactly where it belongs, closed when it needs to be open when invited. She smiles softly at the thought. She doesn't need to be endlessly accessible to be kind. She doesn't need to be unguarded to be loving. She doesn't need to give everyone access to her deepest places in order to be real. Somewhere inside her, there is a sanctuary that remains untouched, not because she is hiding, but because she is honoring it. She locks the door and steps out into the night, carrying that understanding with her. Not as armor, not as distance, but as quiet reverence, a knowing that no matter what the world brings to her tomorrow, there is a place within that remains safe, steady, and entirely her own. A place no one enters. And for the first time in a long while, she trusts herself to keep it that way. They notice the shadow before they notice themselves. It stretches long across the sidewalk, darker than expected, shaped by the streetlight behind them. For a moment, it looks almost like someone else walking ahead, moving when they move, stopping when they stop. They slow their pace. The night is quiet in that way neighborhoods get after most windows have gone dark. A porch light hums softly. Somewhere a dog shifts in its sleep. Their own footsteps sound louder than usual, each one landing with a clear, deliberate rhythm. They glance down again. The shadow has changed shape longer now, thinner, reaching farther than it should. It makes their chest tighten in a small, familiar way. They don't like this time of night. Not because it's dangerous, but because it leaves too much room for thought. During the day, there are distractions, conversations, things that demand attention. At night, the mind wanders freely, and it doesn't always choose gentle places to go. They tell themselves to walk faster, but instead they slow, even more curious despite the discomfort. The shadow isn't threatening. It isn't doing anything. It's just there, following faithfully, no matter how they try to ignore it. They think about how often they've felt this way about parts of themselves. Traits they'd rather not acknowledge. Reactions that surprise them. Thoughts that appear suddenly uninvited and linger longer than they'd like. During the day, they manage these parts carefully. They stay polite, controlled, reasonable. But at night, those edges feel sharper, harder to look away from. A breeze moves through the trees lining the street, and the leaves respond with a soft rustle. The shadow shivers with the movement of branches above, breaking into uneven shapes along the pavement. They stop under the light. The shadow pools around their feet now, shorter, darker, less dramatic. It doesn't stretch ahead anymore. It waits. They stand there, hands in their pockets, feeling the cool air on their face. The light behind them casts a clear outline, honest and unflattering. There's no place for the shadow to hide. They wonder when they started believing that shadows mean something is wrong. Shadows appear because there is light. Without light, there would be nothing to cast them. This is something they know in theory, something simple enough to explain, yet difficult to remember. When the mind starts to judge itself harshly, they shift their weight from one foot to the other. The shadow follows, obedient and immediate. They remember times they've replayed their own mistakes late at night, watching them grow larger in their thoughts, stretching farther than they ever did in reality. One comment, one reaction, one imperfect moment becomes a shape that seems to define them entirely. Standing here, they notice how the shadow distorts when they move, how it lengthens and shrinks depending on their position, not because it has changed, but because the light has. The realization settles slowly. Maybe the parts of themselves they fear aren't growing. Maybe the angle has just changed. They take a step forward out of the brightest part of the light. The shadow stretches again, reaching ahead, exaggerated and unfamiliar. The feeling returns, a slight unease, a tightening in the stomach. They pause, then step back. The shadow shortens. Nothing about them has changed, only their position. They let out a quiet breath, the kind that releases a thought before it has time to turn into a story. The street remains empty. The night remains still. For a long time, they've tried to outrun this feeling, to walk faster than their doubts, to stay busy enough that the shadow never has time to catch up. But it always does. Now, standing here under the streetlight, they try something different. They turn around slowly. The shadow slips behind them, no longer in front, no longer something to watch. They can't see it now, but they know it's still there, doing exactly what it has always done. Following. They stand like that for a moment, facing the light, feeling its warmth faintly on their back. The darkness behind them doesn't feel as heavy when they aren't staring directly into it. They begin to walk again, this time without checking the pavement every few steps. The shadow stays with them, unseen, but present. And for the first time tonight, that doesn't feel like a threat. They walk for a while without thinking about the shadow at all. Their attention drifts to the sound of their breathing, the steady pattern of steps, the quiet consistency of the street. The houses pass by one after another, each one dark or softly lit, holding lives that have already settled into sleep. When a thought tries to pull them back inward, they notice it and keep walking. The street light behind them fades, replaced by another farther ahead. With each shift of light, the shadow changes again, stretching, shrinking, breaking apart, coming back together. It's never the same shape twice, and yet it's always connected to them. They think about how often they've tried to define themselves by their worst moments. How easily the mind collects imperfections and lines them up as evidence, as if they tell the whole story. Tonight those thoughts arrive more gently. They pass a parked car, its surface catching the glow of the light for a brief second before releasing it. The reflection moves across the metal and disappears, leaving nothing behind. It reminds them of how fleeting attention can be when it isn't held in place by fear. They slow near an intersection, waiting for the crosswalk light to change. The road is empty, but habit keeps them still. The red hand glows steadily, patient and unbothered. While they wait, a familiar thought surfaces, a memory they usually avoid. It's imperfect, uncomfortable, tied to a version of themselves they wish had known better. This time they don't turn away. They let the memory be there without explanation or defense. They notice how it feels in the body, where it tightens, where it loosens. They don't add commentary. They don't label it as good or bad. The crosswalk light changes. They step forward, and the memory doesn't follow. It stays behind, fading naturally, like the shadow when the light shifts again. They realize something then, quietly and without ceremony. The shadow has never been chasing them. It has never been trying to overtake them or pull them down. It has only been responding to the light they stand in and the direction they choose to face. When they turn toward the light, the shadow moves out of sight. When they turn away, it stretches ahead and demands attention. Neither position is wrong, but one feels easier to live with. They reach the end of the block and turn the corner, leaving the street lights behind for a stretch of darker road. The shadow becomes faint, barely visible, blending into the night. They don't feel relieved. They feel steady. For years they've tried to get rid of the parts of themselves they don't like, to fix them, to think them away, to pretend they don't exist. All that effort has only made those parts louder in the quiet moments. Now, walking through the softer darkness, they sense a different approach taking shape. They don't need to love every part of themselves tonight. They don't need to understand it all. They don't need to resolve every inner conflict. They only need to stop running. A breeze passes through, carrying the faint smell of damp earth and leaves. It settles on their skin and then moves on, leaving nothing behind. The night feels wider now, less crowded by judgment. As they near their building, the entrance light comes on, automatically illuminating the path ahead. Their shadow appears once more, brief and unremarkable, then disappears as they step inside. The door closes softly behind them. In the quiet stairwell, they pause, hand resting on the railing. The light overhead hums faintly, steady and contained. There is no shadow here, only clean walls and even illumination. They notice how little they miss it. not because it was something to fear, but because it no longer needs their attention. They climb the stairs slowly, unhurried, feeling the solid presence of each step beneath their feet. Their thoughts move at the same pace, no longer racing ahead or circling back. By the time they reach their door, the night feels settled inside them. They turn the key step into the dim room and close the door gently behind them. The light is enough. Some smells aren't overpowering, but if you carry them long enough, they wear you down. Not because they bother anyone else, but because you're the one closest to them. Resentment is like that. It doesn't always flare up as anger. Sometimes it's just a low, lingering odor that clings to everyday moments. Rachel got home after the sky had fully darkened. She set her bag on a chair, slipped off her shoes by the door, and went straight into the kitchen. A long workday, picking up her child, a few unexpected phone calls. She didn't think she was angry at anyone. She just felt tired. A kind of tiredness without a clear source. She opened the fridge, looked inside for a few seconds, then closed it. There was nothing she needed. Not because there wasn't food, but because her mind hadn't decided yet. Rachel turned on the faucet at the sink, letting the water run while she gathered trash from the counter. The sound of the water covered the leftover noise of the day. She pulled the trash bag out of the bin. It was heavier than she expected. As she lifted it, a faint smell drifted up. Not sharp, not obvious, but enough to make her pause. Rachel frowned and bent down to open the bag. Inside were a few old potatoes forgotten in the corner of the cabinet from the week before. No longer usable. She tied the bag shut. A familiar motion. Then set it on the floor, getting ready to take it outside. But before leaving, Rachel stood still for a few seconds. Not because of the smell, but because of another feeling, one she recognized right away, rising quietly in her chest. She thought about a conversation from earlier that afternoon, a careless comment, a remark that seemed small. Rachel had nodded, smiled lightly, said, "It's fine." But her body hadn't forgotten. It held on to the feeling the way the trash bag held the smell of what had gone bad. Rachel didn't think of herself as someone who holds grudges. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She didn't retell the story. But some emotions, when they aren't spoken, find their own way to stay. They settle into a corner somewhere, waiting until they're heavy enough to start bothering you. She took the trash outside and dropped it into the large bin in front of the house. When the lid closed, the smell vanished instantly. Rachel stood there for a moment and took a deep breath. The night air was cool and clean. A small sense of relief arrived faster than she expected. Back in the kitchen, Rachel washed her hands. Warm water ran between her fingers. She noticed she'd been gripping the trash bag tighter than necessary. Her hand felt slightly sore. So did her shoulders. She let her shoulders drop and allowed the water to carry away whatever was still clinging. A very simple thought appeared. If she kept that bag of rotten potatoes in the kitchen for a few more days, no one would be affected more than her. The smell wouldn't drift into the neighbors' houses. It would stay right here closest to her. And resentment works the same way. Rachel leaned back against the sink as the water slowed. She didn't try to analyze her feelings. She didn't need to name them. She just noticed that some things had reached the point where they needed to be taken out. Not to prove she was right, just so she wouldn't have to live with the smell anymore. She turned off the faucet. The kitchen grew quieter. Soft yellow light reflected off the clean counter. Nothing big had changed. But the air felt different. A little lighter, a little easier to breathe. Rachel knew she wouldn't always remember to check the corners of her inner cabinets. Sometimes she would forget, and the smell would return. But tonight, simply noticing that she had been carrying something spoiled already felt like a beginning. She dried her hands, hung the towel back on its hook, and stood still for a moment in the familiar kitchen. There was nothing she needed to do right away, nothing she needed to react to. Just a body that had finally set down a heavy bag it had been carrying for a little too long. After finishing the kitchen, Rachel didn't turn on the TV. She switched off most of the lights, leaving only the soft glow of a small lamp near the sink. The space felt wider with less light filling it. She noticed she didn't need any more stimulation. The day had already been long enough. Rachel walked into the living room and sat down on the sofa. It sank slightly beneath her, supporting her back in a familiar way. She took off her watch and placed it on the table. A small action, but her body felt as if something tight around her wrist had finally been loosened after a long day. The air in the house felt different. No lingering smell. No need to avoid anything. She breathed in then out more slowly than usual, not because she was trying to relax, but because nothing was pushing her anymore. She thought briefly about the conversation from the afternoon. Not to analyze it, just to see it as a moment that had already passed. At the time, she hadn't said anything, not because she was weak, but because she didn't have the space to speak yet. And that was okay. Not everything needs to be resolved right away to be considered fine. Rachel stood up and went into the bathroom, splashing cool water on her face. It woke her up a little, but in a gentle way. When she lifted her head, she looked at herself in the mirror. Not closely, not to search for flaws, just seeing someone who was tired and allowed to rest. She dried her face, turned off the bathroom light, and walked slowly toward the bedroom. Each step felt lighter than when she had first come home. Not because every emotion had been worked through, but because she was no longer carrying the rotten potato bag inside her. It had been set outside where it belonged. When she lay down, Rachel didn't think about whether she should forgive or not. Those questions could wait. Tonight, she only needed to stop making herself uncomfortable. The blanket rested over her shoulders, the temperature just right. She pulled it up a little higher, then stopped. Some kinds of relief don't come from understanding something big. They come from very simple actions, like taking something spoiled out of your living space. No announcements, no arguments, just setting it down. Rachel turned onto her side, finding her familiar position. Her breath moved in and out, steady and calm. There was nothing she needed to remember, nothing she needed to hold on to. Any leftover thoughts, if they appeared at all, drifted past as lightly as a smell fading from the air. If she remembered the situation again tomorrow, that would be okay. It might return the way you sometimes forget to check the kitchen cabinet on another day. But tonight, she had already cleaned up, and her body knew it. The room was quiet. No sudden sounds, no conclusions, just a clean open space enough to rest. And in that space, sleep arrived without hurry, the way it does when the house is finally clean and there's no lingering smell left to pull you back. His hands were already tired before he realized how tightly he'd been clenching them. All day they had wrapped around tools, gripped handles, tightened bolts, and twisted parts into place with practiced strength. The work itself wasn't unusual. He had done it for years. What felt different was the tension that stayed even when there was nothing left to hold. The garage was quiet now, the kind of quiet that comes after machines are shut down and the air slowly loses its heat. A single overhead light buzzed faintly, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. He stood at the workbench, staring at his hands. The fingers were still curled inward, as if they were expecting resistance. The muscles along his forearms felt dense, overworked, like ropes pulled too tight for too long. Earlier that day, something had happened. Nothing dramatic, no shouting, no slammed doors, just a comment made in a certain tone, a suggestion that landed more like an accusation, followed by the familiar expectation that he would absorb it and keep moving. He had done exactly that. Now alone in the garage, the moment replayed in his head, not as words, but as a sensation, a tightening, a pressure that lived in his palms and wrists, creeping up his arms. He reached for the wrench on the table and lifted it, then set it back down again. The metal made a small clink as it touched the surface, sharp and clean. That sound pulled him into the present. He flexed his fingers once slowly and noticed how stiff they felt. When he tried to fully open his hand, there was resistance, like his body had forgotten how. He walked over to the sink in the corner of the garage and turned on the tap. Water rushed out, cool and steady, splashing against the metal basin. He held his hands under the stream. At first, nothing changed. His fingers stayed half-curled, letting the water run over them without fully meeting it. Then gradually, he let them open. The sensation was immediate. Water slipped through the spaces between his fingers, impossible to hold, no matter how hard he tried. The harder he squeezed, the faster it escaped. He loosened his grip. The water flowed smoothly now, touching his palms, his knuckles, his wrists, without resistance. His hands felt lighter, less rigid, like they were remembering a shape they had known before effort took over. Something in his chest shifted. He realized then that the anger he'd been carrying all day felt exactly like that clenched fist. It was a response he didn't question anymore, something his body did automatically when it sensed threat or disrespect. A tight hand felt strong. A tight hand felt ready, but it couldn't receive anything. He shut off the water and dried his hands on a rag hanging nearby. The cloth brushed over his skin, rough but familiar, grounding him in the simple reality of touch. He thought about how many times he'd gone through entire days like this, fists clenched around things that had already passed. Conversations that were over, moments that no longer existed. Holding on to them hadn't changed the outcome, it had only exhausted him. He sat down on the low stool near the workbench and rested his forearms on his knees. His hands lay open now, palms facing upward, empty. The position felt strange at first, exposed, unprepared. Then it felt honest. He didn't suddenly understand the other person's behavior. He didn't excuse it. The irritation was still there, faint but present. What had changed was his relationship to it. He wasn't gripping it anymore. The overhead light flickered once, then steadied. The garage felt cooler now, calmer, as if it too had relaxed when he did. He stayed there for a few minutes, breathing, letting the open space in his hands teach his body what his mind already knew. There was strength in holding on, but there was also strength in opening up. And tonight, he was beginning to see the difference. He turned off the light in the garage and stepped outside, pulling the door closed behind him with a soft, familiar sound. The evening air was cooler now, brushing against his face and arms, easing the leftover warmth from the day. As he walked toward his car, he noticed his hands again. They were no longer curled into tight shapes. His fingers hung naturally at his sides, moving with each step instead of bracing for something that wasn't there. It surprised him how much that small change affected the rest of his body. His shoulders dropped. His breathing slowed. Even his thoughts felt less crowded. Driving home, the road stretched out under the headlights in a calm, predictable way. The incident from earlier tried to surface again, the tone of the comment, the familiar feeling of being pushed just a little too hard. This time, his hand stayed relaxed on the steering wheel. He didn't argue with the memory. He didn't replay it to find a better response. He simply noticed how it felt and let it pass without closing his grip around it. At a stoplight, he looked down at his hands resting on the wheel. Open, steady, ready but not tense. That was when the thought came clearly. A closed fist can protect, but it can't connect. All day he had been ready to defend himself even when there was nothing left to defend against. The fist stayed closed out of habit, not necessity. At home, he washed his hands again, feeling the warm water run freely across his palms. He noticed how natural it felt now to let it flow. How strange it would be to try to hold on to it. He dried his hands slowly and moved through his evening routine without rush. Dinner was simple. The house was quiet. The day began to loosen its hold on him. Forgiveness entered his thoughts again, but without pressure. It wasn't a demand to soften towards someone who had hurt him. It wasn't an instruction to forget. It was the understanding that keeping his hands clenched only guaranteed that he would stay tense, even in moments that deserved ease. To forgive in this sense was to open his hands and stop carrying what no longer needed to be carried. Later, as he sat on the edge of the bed, he rested his hands on his thighs, palms open. The position no longer felt exposed. It felt grounded. He realized that when his hands were open, his body trusted the world a little more. Not because the world had changed, but because he wasn't constantly preparing for impact. The day had included frustration. That was true, but it didn't have to define the night. As he lay down, his breathing deepened naturally. His muscles softened one by one, starting with his hands, then his arms, then the rest of his body. The fist was gone. In its place was something quieter and far more useful. Space. And in that space, rest came easily, not as an escape, but as a natural result of finally letting go. In the greenhouse, the morning has its own kind of quiet. It isn't the quiet of a room with nothing in it. It's the quiet of living things that don't speak but are still doing their work. The air is warm and damp, and the plastic panels above hold soft beads of condensation that catch the early light like small, steady stars. He walks down the narrow aisle with a hose in one hand, careful not to drag it too hard across the floor. The water inside moves with a gentle weight, and when he turns the nozzle, a fine spray comes out with a soft hiss, like a calm exhale. He waters the seedlings one tray at a time. The tiny plants don't look like much yet. Just thin stems, small leaves, the kind of green that seems almost too fragile to last. If someone who didn't know anything walked in, they might shrug and assume nothing important is happening. But he knows better. He has spent enough mornings in this place to understand how life builds itself quietly, not in sudden jumps, not in dramatic transformations, but in tiny, almost invisible shifts that only add up if you keep showing up. He moves slowly, watching the soil darken as it drinks. The smell is earthy and clean, like the inside of a garden after rain. The sound of water landing is soft but constant, a rhythm he has come to rely on more than he expected. Sometimes he thinks he likes the plants because they don't rush him. They don't ask him who he is. They don't ask what he's planning. They don't ask why he hasn't figured everything out yet. They simply grow at their own pace, and if he is patient and consistent, they respond. Outside the greenhouse, people talk about big dreams, big goals, big changes, big results. He has heard it plenty of times. In passing conversations, in loud advice, in the way the world seems to favor anything that looks impressive on the surface. The message is always the same. If you want something, you need to push harder, move faster, prove you deserve it. He used to believe that. He used to believe that if he wasn't becoming something huge, then he was wasting his time. If he couldn't point to a major achievement, then his life was too small to matter. That belief sat in him like a weight for years. Even now, it hasn't disappeared completely. It still shows up on certain mornings when he looks at the trays of seedlings and feels a strange impatience rise in his chest, like a voice saying, "This is it. This is all you've got." He knows that voice. It's the same voice that makes him compare his life to other people's highlight reels. The same voice that turns other people's success into evidence of his failure. The same voice that calls slow progress stuck. He tightens his grip on the hose for a moment, then loosens it again, reminding himself to keep the spray gentle. Too much water at once doesn't help. It floods, it harms. The seedlings don't respond well to force. He thinks about how true that is for people too, even though it's something he forgets often. You can't pressure yourself into blooming. You can't punish yourself into becoming whole. The plants are teaching him that slowly, without words. He finishes one row and steps back, letting the water settle into the soil. The droplets on the leaves hold their shape for a second before sliding down, disappearing into the base where they're needed. He looks at the smallest seedling in the tray, the one that always seems behind the others. It stands there quiet, not apologizing for being small. And for a moment, He imagines what it might be dreaming if a seedling could dream. Not a small dream, a full dream. A dream of being a tree that spreads wide, with roots deep enough to hold steady through storms, with branches that reach out without fear, with shade that comforts anyone who stands beneath it. The thought makes something in him soften, because he knows that feeling. He has carried a dream like that too. Not necessarily to be famous or admired, but to be solid. To be someone who doesn't break easily. To feel like he belongs in his own life. To wake up without that constant sense of falling behind. Sometimes he wonders if that dream is too big for him. Sometimes he thinks he should shrink it to match what his life looks like right now. But then he looks at the seedling again, thin and quiet, and he remembers something simple. A seed doesn't have to look like a tree in order to be one. It just has to keep going. He turns the nozzle slightly and gives the tray one more gentle pass, making sure the corners aren't dry. The water lands like a soft promise, not hurried, not dramatic, just consistent. And as he moves down the aisle toward the next row, he feels the pressure in his chest ease a little, replaced by something steadier. Not certainty, not confidence that everything will work out. Just a calm understanding that growth is not always visible from day to day, and that being small right now is not a sign that he is failing. It might simply be the beginning. He coils the hose neatly against the wall and wipes his hands on the side of his pants, leaving faint dark marks that fade as the fabric dries. The work isn't finished, but this part of it is, and that feels enough for now. The greenhouse holds its warmth as he moves through it, the air wrapping around him in a way that feels protective rather than heavy. The seedlings stand quietly in their trays, unchanged to the eye, yet already different from how they were a few minutes ago. Growth doesn't announce itself. It doesn't ask to be witnessed. It happens whether anyone is paying attention or not. He pauses at the end of the aisle and looks back at the rows of green, all at different stages. None of them ahead or behind in any meaningful way. They are simply responding to the conditions they've been given, doing the only work they know how to do. He thinks about how often he's tried to rush his own becoming, how he's compared his middle to someone else's outcome, how he's measured his worth against timelines that were never his, how he's mistaken impatience for motivation. Those habits didn't come from nowhere. They came from fear. From the belief that if he didn't grow fast enough, he would be left behind, overlooked, forgotten. But the plants don't grow out of fear. They grow out of alignment. They grow because the soil is right, the water is steady, and the light arrives when it can. They don't question whether they deserve the sun. They don't hold back because another plant nearby seems taller. They just receive what's offered and respond honestly. He steps closer to the smallest seedling again, the one he noticed earlier. It hasn't changed, not in any visible way, but something about it feels more present now. It stands without urgency, without comparison, without apology. It doesn't dream of being anything other than what it already is on its way to becoming. That realization lands gently in him. Maybe the problem was never that his dream was too big. Maybe the problem was that he kept trying to live it too early. A seed doesn't strain to act like a tree. It doesn't harden its stem in advance. It doesn't borrow strength it hasn't grown yet. It trusts the process it's inside of. He places his hand lightly on the edge of the tray, not touching the plant, just feeling the solid frame beneath it. The structure exists to support growth, not to rush it. For the first time in a long while, he considers the idea that he might not need to add anything to himself. No new identity, no dramatic reinvention, no proof that he's doing life right. He might only need to stop stripping himself of patience. Stop crowding his days with comparison. Stop calling slowness a flaw. Stop confusing visibility with value. The greenhouse door opens slightly as a breeze shifts outside, and fresh air slips in cool against the warmth. The balance feels good. Not too much, not too little. He breathes it in and feels something settle. He doesn't suddenly believe that everything will work out. He doesn't imagine a future where doubt never returns. But he does feel a quiet permission to stay where he is without judging it, to grow at the speed that feels true. As he turns to leave, the seedlings remain behind, unchanged in appearance, yet undeniably alive, continuing their work without needing his attention. He knows that when he returns tomorrow, they will have moved forward in ways too small to measure, yet real all the same. And maybe he will too. Because the dream he's been carrying was never about becoming impressive overnight. It was about becoming rooted. Strong enough to stand, flexible enough to bend, patient enough to let time do what it does best. He switches off the greenhouse light and steps into the morning carrying nothing extra with him. Just the understanding that even the smallest seed holds the memory of a forest, and that healing-like growth begins the moment you stop asking yourself to be something you are not yet ready to be. He doesn't realize how tense he is until he turns the faucet off. The kitchen goes quiet all at once, and the sudden silence makes him pause, one hand still resting on the edge of the sink. The overhead light hums faintly. A single drop of water clings to the metal, then falls sharp and clear in the stillness. He stands there longer than necessary, staring at the bottom of the sink where the water has already disappeared. The day has left a residue behind. Not one specific problem, not one dramatic moment, but a buildup of small things. Delays. Comments that landed the wrong way. Tasks that took more effort than they should have. None of it feels serious enough to complain about, yet together they sit heavy in his chest. He reaches for a glass from the drying rack and holds it under the faucet again, filling it halfway. The sound of running water is soothing in a way he doesn't question. It's steady, predictable. It doesn't ask him to explain anything. He sets the glass on the counter and leans against it, arms crossed loosely, eyes unfocused. His thoughts begin to line themselves up one after another, as they often do when the house is quiet. They review the day carefully, pausing at moments that still feel sharp. Each thought seems small on its own, but together they create a familiar tightness, like something dissolving slowly inside him. He opens a small container and sprinkles salt into the glass without really thinking about it. The grains disappear almost instantly, leaving the water clear and unchanged to the eye. He lifts the glass, takes a sip, and immediately winces. too much. The taste spreads across his tongue, sharp and overwhelming, catching him off guard. He swallows anyway, feeling the discomfort settle, then sets the glass down with a quiet clink. He exhales through his nose, half amused, half irritated with himself. That's how it feels lately, he thinks. Like everything has the same flavor. Too intense, too much at once. Even the smallest issue seems to leave a bitter aftertaste that lingers longer than it should. He pours the glass out and rinses it, watching the salty water swirl away down the drain. He refills it this time, adding only a small pinch. He stirs slowly with a spoon, the metal tapping softly against the glass. He tastes it again. Better. Still noticeable, but manageable. He sets the glass down and rests his palms on the counter, staring at the surface, where the overhead light reflects back at him. The reflection is imperfect, slightly warped, but steady. He's always believed that stress comes from what happens to you. From the amount of pressure, the weight of circumstances, the number of problems piling up at once. It feels logical. If things are hard, of course it hurts. But standing here now, he notices something else. The salt didn't change. The glass did. He reaches for a larger pitcher from the cabinet and fills it with water. The sound is deeper this time, fuller. He pours the same amount of salt into it, stirs, and takes a sip. The taste is barely there. It's not gone completely, but it no longer dominates. It no longer demands all his attention. He leans back against the counter, holding the pitcher loosely, feeling its weight in his hands. His breathing slows without instruction, like his body has recognized something before his mind can catch up. The problems of the day haven't disappeared. He knows that. Tomorrow will bring its own version of the same challenges. But the way they sit inside him feels different now. Less concentrated, less urgent. He realizes how often he's been living in a small glass. His days packed tight, his attention narrowed, his mind circling the same thoughts again and again, leaving no room for anything else. In that space, even a little stress has nowhere to go, but straight into him. He pours himself another glass from the pitcher and drinks slowly, this time noticing how the water moves, how it cools his throat, how it settles. The bitterness is faint now, almost unimportant. He stands there, letting the moment stretch, not trying to turn it into a lesson or a promise. Just noticing how different it feels to have more room. The kitchen hasn't changed. The light hums the same way. The night outside remains quiet and ordinary. But something inside him has widened. He doesn't rush to clean up. The pitcher stays on the counter, the glass beside it, both catching the soft kitchen light. He leans his hips against the edge and lets his thoughts move without pushing them in any direction. For once, they don't crowd him. A familiar worry drifts into awareness, something unfinished from earlier in the day. Normally, it would tighten his chest immediately, pulling his focus inward until nothing else exists. Now it arrives and settles gently like a grain of salt falling into deep water. It's still there. It just doesn't burn. He notices how his breathing has changed. Slower, fuller, not forced. His shoulders feel less lifted, his jaw unclenched. The shift is subtle but unmistakable, like the difference between holding a cup too tightly and realizing you can loosen your grip without dropping it. He thinks about how often he's tried to solve stress by removing it. Fix the problem. Finish the task. Say the right thing. Move on quickly. Sometimes that works. Often it doesn't. Standing here now, he understands something his body has known longer than his mind. Some things don't need to be removed. They need more space around them. He pours the remaining water from the glass back into the pitcher, then tops it off with more from the faucet. The sound fills the room again, steady and generous. He stirs once slow and deliberate, watching the movement spread evenly. He takes another sip. There's no sharpness now. Just cool water, clean and ordinary. The moment reminds him of other times in his life when stress felt manageable even when things weren't easy. Long walks where his thoughts gradually loosened. Conversations that widened his perspective. Even simple routines that gave his mind something larger to rest in. It was never because the problems disappeared. It was because his inner space grew. He carries the pitcher to the table and sits down, letting the chair scrape softly against the floor. The kitchen feels quieter from here, less like a place to do things and more like a place to be. He doesn't tell himself to think positive thoughts. He doesn't try to replace worries with gratitude or lessons. He simply lets them pass through the wider field of his attention, noticing how they no longer get stuck. A thought arises. Another follows. Then a pause. In that pause, there is relief, not the dramatic kind, but the kind that comes from not being squeezed. He realizes how much of his overthinking has been fueled by constriction. Tight schedules, tight expectations, tight narratives about who he should be and how he should handle things. When the mind is held too tightly, even kindness can feel sharp. He finishes the glass and sets it down empty, now clean and light. The pitcher is still half full. He knows he can come back to it later, refill it again if he wants. That feels comforting in an unexpected way. The night continues outside the window, quiet and unremarkable. No breakthrough arrives. No final understanding clicks into place. And yet he feels different, not fixed, just less crowded. He stands, rinses the glass, and places it upside down in the drying rack. The simple motion feels complete in itself, not a step toward anything else. Before turning off the light, he pauses once more, taking in the room. The counter, the sink, the faint reflection in the dark window. Everything looks the same as it did earlier. Only now there's more room inside him to hold it. He switches off the light and leaves the kitchen, the quiet following him down the hall. His thoughts slow to match his steps, spreading out, no longer competing for attention. Tonight the salt is still there, but the water is wide enough. Some things are handed to us without being asked for. Not gifts, but words. A tone. A comment wrapped in irritation. And we often assume that because it was sent, it automatically belongs to us. But maybe like any other gift, if we don't accept it, it stays with the person who offered it. Jasmine was 34, a real estate agent used to her phone buzzing all day long. Quick texts, rushed calls, promises made while everyone was tense. That evening, she pulled up in front of her house, turned off the engine, but didn't get out right away. The streetlight reflected off the windshield, casting a dim glow just enough to see the dashboard clearly. Her phone vibrated. A voicemail. The caller's name appeared. Jasmine knew that voice. She had heard it many times on good days and on difficult ones. She didn't open it immediately. She just stared at the screen for a few seconds, as if considering a door. Finally, she pressed play. The voice came through not loud, but sharp, not openly insulting. Just sentences laced with disappointment, blame, and a subtle edge of contempt carefully packaged. When the voicemail ended, the screen went quiet again. But inside Jasmine, it didn't. She placed the phone face down on the seat beside her. Her hand trembled slightly. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for her to feel it. A familiar heat rose in her chest, not exploding, just spreading slowly, like holding something that isn't very hot, but burns if you hold it long enough. Jasmine thought about calling back, thought about the sharp responses she could deliver, thought about explaining herself, then thought about staying silent. Each thought opened a different path, but they all started in the same place. She was holding something that had just been handed to her. She breathed in, then out. Not deep, not long. Just enough to notice she had been holding her breath. She looked at the phone face down, lying still like an ordinary object. Nothing in it was demanding an immediate response. There was no countdown clock. No rule forcing her to open her hands and receive it. Jasmine remembered an old question she'd heard somewhere before. If someone gives you a gift, but you don't accept it, who does the gift belong to? She didn't think about it as a moral lesson. It simply appeared clear and real, right there on the passenger seat beside her. The words in that voicemail, however unpleasant, were only sounds that had already passed. They couldn't enter her body unless she opened the door. But her habit, like many people's, was to open that door quickly, to take it in, and carry it along. Jasmine rested her hand on the steering wheel. Her fingers touched the cool surface. She noticed the contrast between that coolness and the heat spreading in her chest. Both existed at the same time. And for the first time that evening, she realized she had a very small choice to set the phone aside or to keep holding it. She chose to set it down, not to throw it away, not to block the number, just to turn it face down so the screen couldn't look at her anymore. A small movement, but it created a necessary distance, like placing an object that doesn't belong to you back on the table. Jasmine opened the car door and stepped outside. The night air was cooler than the air inside the car. She took a longer breath than before. The heat didn't disappear immediately, but it stopped being fed. No replies formed in her mind. No new story took shape. She locked the car, heard the familiar click, and walked toward the front door. The phone stayed in her pocket silent. The gift was still there, but it hadn't been accepted. And that alone was enough to send the evening in a different direction. Jasmine stepped inside and closed the door behind her. The sound was soft, just enough to signal that the long day was now outside. She didn't turn on all the lights. She left only the gentle glow from the living room, just enough to see where she was going. The quiet welcomed her without asking for anything more. She set her keys on the table, hung up her jacket and stood still for a few seconds. Not out of hesitation, just letting her body recalibrate like after leaving a noisy place. In that quiet pause, Jasmine noticed that her phone was still silent in her pocket. No vibration, no light, nothing reminding her that something needed a response. She took the phone out and placed it on the table beside the sofa face down. Not a dramatic gesture, just setting it there like placing an unopened package off to the side. She sat down, leaning back into the soft cushions. Her shoulders dropped slightly, almost without her noticing. The words from the voicemail were still echoing faintly in her mind, but they no longer felt as sharp as they had earlier, when they weren't being picked up and turned over again and again. They began to fade like a distant sound lowering its own volume. Jasmine wasn't trying to forget. She just wasn't replaying it anymore. She went into the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water. Cool, clear. She drank in small sips, feeling her throat soften. Sometimes taking care of the body in the simplest way is the quickest way for the mind to stop arguing. Back on the sofa, Jasmine sat for a while. She didn't turn on the news. She didn't open social media. Those places often carry even more unrequested gifts. Tonight, she didn't need to accept anything else. She thought about how many words over the years she had taken in that didn't really belong to her. Taken out of politeness, taken out of habit, taken out of fear that silence would make things worse. But silence sometimes is just closing the window when the wind gets too strong. Jasmine stood up and went into the bathroom, splashing cool water on her face. It washed away the fatigue of the day. When she lifted her head, she looked at herself in the mirror. Not inspecting, not judging, just seeing someone who was learning not to open her hands so quickly anymore. She dried her face, turned off the light, and walked slowly toward the bedroom. Each step steady, unhurried. The phone stayed in the living room. She didn't bring it with her. She didn't need to. Tonight, there was no conversation that needed to keep going in her head. When she lay down, Jasmine pulled the blanket up to her shoulders. The temperature was just right. The air in the room was cool and still. She turned onto her side, finding her familiar position. Her body responded almost immediately, as if it had been waiting for this moment. If those words return at another time, that's okay. They can exist somewhere, but they don't need to be held. Not everything that's offered needs to be accepted to prove anything. Jasmine closed her eyes. She didn't force herself to sleep. She let her eyelids grow heavy with the rhythm of her breath. Inhale, exhale, slow and even. No reaction waiting, no answer being prepared. Some nights peace comes from realizing you're allowed to refuse gently, without explaining, without pushing back, simply by not opening your hands. The room settled into silence. Everything was in its place. And in that stillness, sleep arrived without words, like setting a gift back where it truly belongs. She noticed it first in her shoulders. Not as pain, not exactly, but as a constant low-level tension that never fully went away, no matter how many times she rolled them back or stretched her neck between clients. The day had been full. The chairs rarely empty, the mirrors always reflecting movement. Snip, snip. The sound of scissors moved steadily through the room, rhythmic and familiar. Most days the work grounded her. The repetition, the focus, the quiet trust between hands and hair. But today there had been someone who rubbed against her patience in a way she couldn't quite ignore. Not loudly, not openly. Just a few comments, a certain tone. The kind of energy that scraped instead of touched. She didn't respond to it at the time. She smiled. She kept working. She did what she always did, letting professionalism smooth over the edges. Now, after closing time, she swept the floor slowly, the soft shh of the broom filling the quiet space. Small piles of hair gathered near her feet, reminders of the day's work, light and harmless. The comments replayed anyway. Not word for word, but as a feeling, a friction, like something had been dragging across her all afternoon, leaving her irritated without a clear place to point to. She leaned the broom against the wall and sat down in one of the chairs, the vinyl cool against the back of her legs. In the mirror, she saw her own reflection, tired but composed, the same face she showed everyone else. Her hands rested in her lap, palms down, fingers relaxed. That's when the image came to her. Sandpaper. She thought about how it works, how rough it feels at first contact, how it scrapes and stings if you press too hard against it, how the instinct is always to pull away or push back. But she also knew what sandpaper was actually for. It doesn't hurt for no reason. It wears things down. It smooths surfaces over time. She stood up and walked over to the small supply shelf in the corner, where bottles and tools sat neatly arranged. She picked up a piece of actual sandpaper left over from a small repair job weeks ago. She ran her thumb lightly across it. Rough, uncomfortable, effective. The thought landed quietly. Some people don't show up in your life to be soft. They show up to rub against you, to test the edges you didn't know were sharp, to expose where you still react instead of choose. That didn't mean their behavior was kind. It didn't mean it was justified. It just meant she didn't have to become rough in response. She set the sandpaper back down and returned to the mirror. The comments tried to rise again, but this time they felt different, less personal, less sticky. She noticed something else then. Each time she replayed the interaction, she tightened. Each time she imagined what she should have said, her jaw clenched. It wasn't the person hurting her anymore. It was the friction she kept creating by pressing against it. She took a slow breath and let her shoulders drop. What if she didn't push back? What if she didn't pull away? What if she let the contact happen without resistance? The idea felt strange, almost counterintuitive. She had always believed that strength meant standing firm, protecting yourself by being just as hard as whatever came at you. But sitting there alone in the quiet shop, she saw another option. If she stayed still, stayed soft, the roughness wouldn't have anything to work against. Sandpaper only smooths what presses into it. She picked up the broom again and finished sweeping her movements, unhurried now. The irritation hadn't vanished, but it no longer felt sharp. It was dulling, losing its edge with each steady breath. As she turned off the lights and locked the door, the day settled behind her. The interaction still existed. The person would likely still be the same tomorrow, but she didn't feel scraped raw. She felt polished. Not because she had endured in silence, not because she had swallowed anything, but because she had stopped fighting the friction and let it pass without turning herself into something coarse. The walk to her car felt quieter than usual. The street outside the shop had already settled into evening lights glowing softly behind windows, the sound of traffic moving at a distance instead of pressing in close. She noticed how her body moved now, less guarded, less braced for contact. Earlier, that same walk might have carried the weight of the day with it. The comments would have followed her, replaying themselves as she drove home, sharpening with each repetition. Tonight they stayed behind, not because she pushed them away, but because there was nothing left for them to catch on to. As she drove, her hands rested lightly on the steering wheel. She could feel the texture beneath her palms without gripping it, aware, but not tense. The road flowed smoothly, lane lines slipping past in an easy rhythm. Her thoughts returned briefly to the person from earlier. She saw them more clearly now, without the charge that had made everything feel personal. Someone restless. Someone rough around the edges. Someone moving through the world with more friction than necessary. It didn't excuse the behavior, but it explained why it felt the way it did. Sandpaper, she thought again. Rough because it's meant to wear something down. Rough because it hasn't learned another way to make contact. The difference now was that she didn't feel like the surface being ground away. She had learned when to soften. At home, she moved through her evening slowly, changing into comfortable clothes, rinsing her hands at the sink, watching the water bead and slide off her skin. Even that small sensation felt different, smoother somehow. She realized then that forgiveness, at least in this form, wasn't about welcoming someone's roughness back into her space. It wasn't about inviting more friction or pretending it didn't hurt. It was about refusing to let someone else's texture determine her own. When she stayed soft, the sandpaper had nothing to work on. Later, sitting on the edge of the bed, she rested her hands on her thighs and noticed how calm they felt. No twitching, no urge to brace. The day had included discomfort. That was true. But it hadn't worn her down. Instead, it had shown her something useful. She didn't need to harden herself to survive rough people. She didn't need to become sharp in return. She could stay smooth and in doing so protect her peace without a single argument. As she lay down, her breathing deepened naturally. The room was quiet. The tension that had once lived in her shoulders had dissolved into something softer, something almost imperceptible. The sandpaper would exist again in other forms on other days. But she no longer feared it. She knew now that when she stopped pressing against it, it was the roughness that wore away, not her. And with that understanding, rest came easily, steady and unforced, like sleep had simply been waiting for her to stop resisting. She rests her forearms on the edge of the bathtub and watches the water settle. The room is dim lit only by a small lamp near the sink. The rest of the apartment has already gone quiet. The kind of quiet that arrives after everything that needs to be done has been done, whether perfectly or not. She dips her fingers into the bath and moves them slowly, creating thin lines across the surface. The water responds immediately, rippling outward in soft circles that overlap and disappear as quickly as they form. She pauses and waits. The surface smooths itself out, returning to stillness without effort. She tries again this time, dragging her hand gently from one side of the tub to the other, as if drawing something. For a moment, the shape exists, a wavering line, imperfect but visible. Then it breaks apart, dissolving into smaller movements until there's nothing left to point to. She exhales a quiet sound she hadn't planned to make. It reminds her of how her thoughts have been lately. They appear clearly, sometimes sharply, and then fade before she can decide what to do with them. Ideas about the past, questions about the future, observations that feel important for a moment, then lose their weight. She has a habit of trying to hold on to them. Not physically, of course, but mentally. She repeats them, examines them, turns them over as if clarity will come from staying longer. More often than not, all that happens is exhaustion. She trails her fingers through the water again, this time faster. The surface becomes busy, restless, layered with movement. The ripples collide, reflect, cancel each other out. The water looks unsettled now, as if it's lost its sense of direction. She pulls her hand away and watches. It takes a few seconds, but the movement fades. The surface smooths itself out, patient and unbothered by what just happened. She leans her head back against the tile and closes her eyes for a moment. The warmth of the bath seeps into her skin, loosening something in her shoulders. She thinks about how often she's done this to her mind, stirred it repeatedly, added thought after thought, convinced that more thinking would lead to clarity. Instead, it only made everything cloudy. The water doesn't hold on to what she draws in it. It doesn't remember the lines she makes. It doesn't judge whether they were good or bad. It simply returns to itself. She opens her eyes and looks again at the smooth surface. It reflects the dim light in soft, broken shapes. Nothing is fixed. Nothing stays. She dips her finger in once more, just enough to disturb the surface. A small ripple forms, then fades. She resists the urge to do more. A thought arises, something about a conversation earlier in the day. Normally, she would follow it immediately, replaying it, refining it, wondering what it meant. This time she notices it like a ripple appearing briefly, then spreading outward. She doesn't chase it. The thought thins out, then disappears, leaving behind a quiet she doesn't rush to fill. Her breathing slows. The room feels larger, as if space has been added without moving any walls. She rests her hands on the cool porcelain and stays there, watching nothing happen. It occurs to her how strange that would have felt not long ago. To sit without engaging, to let thoughts come and go without intervening. She used to believe that if she didn't hold on to them, she might lose something important. Now, watching the water return to stillness again and again, she senses the opposite. Nothing important is lost. The bathwater remains warm. The room remains quiet. She remains here. The surface of the water waits open and unmarked, ready for the next movement or none at all. She stays in the bath longer than she planned to, not because she's waiting for something, but because there's nothing pushing her to leave. The water holds its warmth steadily wrapping around her legs in a way that feels supportive rather than heavy. She lifts her hand and lets the last drops fall back into the tub. Each one lands with a soft sound barely noticeable, sending out tiny ripples that vanish almost as soon as they appear. She watches them fade. Her mind, so used to grabbing onto moments like these and turning them into reflections or lessons, hesitates. A thought starts to form, then pauses as if unsure whether it needs to complete itself. She notices the pause. There's a gentle relief in not finishing the thought and not turning it into anything solid. The quiet that follows feels clean, like a surface that hasn't been written on yet. She remembers how often she's tried to make her thoughts permanent, writing them down, repeating them, holding them close, afraid that if she didn't, they might disappear forever. As if the value of a thought depended on how long she could keep it alive. But the water tells a different story. No line she draws here is meant to last. No shape is meant to be preserved. And yet, the water is no poorer for it. If anything, it feels freer. She traces one last slow circle with her finger, watching the motion spread outward. This time she doesn't name it. She doesn't compare it to anything else. She simply observes the movement and lets it finish on its own. The surface grows still again. A thought about tomorrow drifts in. A task, a small concern. She sees it clearly, like a faint reflection on the water's surface. She lets it be there. Then, she lets it go. It slips away without resistance, leaving no trace behind. The absence doesn't feel like loss. It feels like space. She shifts slightly, leaning her head against the side of the tub, eyes half closed. The bathroom feels cocooned, separate from the rest of the world. The usual urge to review the day, to replay moments and analyze them, doesn't arrive. There's nothing to stir. She realizes how much of her overthinking has come from revisiting the same mental drawings again and again, tracing the same lines, hoping they'll finally hold their shape. Each time the result has been the same: more movement, more disturbance, less clarity. The water never asks her to stop drawing. It simply shows her what happens when she does. She reaches for the towel and drapes it over the edge of the tub, then slowly stands, feeling the air cool against her skin. Even now, droplets slide down and fall away, leaving her lighter unmarked. She wraps the towel around herself and takes one last look at the bathwater. The surface is calm, reflecting the dim light, softly holding nothing from before. She turns off the lamp and steps out of the bathroom, the quiet following her without effort. The hallway is dark, but not unsettling. Each step feels deliberate and unhurried. As she settles into bed, thoughts still appear, but they come like ripples from a distant touch, faint and brief. She doesn't reach for them. She lets them pass. The mind, given nothing to hold on to, begins to rest. Tonight she doesn't need to remember every thought. She doesn't need to finish every mental picture. Like painting on water, her thoughts can appear shimmer for a moment and fade, leaving the surface just as it was. And that is enough. The stories are done. The lessons are learned. There is nothing left to do. If you found peace in this sanctuary tonight, you can return here whenever you wish. We will keep the fire lit for you. If you wish to support this channel, you may leave a gentle like or subscribe so we can find each other again in the vast ocean of the internet. But now, as we move into the final space of rest, let's plant seeds of peace deep into your subconscious. Let go, drift, and let these truths become your own. My thoughts are settling like sediment in a glass of still water. Go of all ripples. The surface of my mind is becoming glass. Like a river flows to the ocean, my worries flow away from me. Obstacles without resistance. The waters of sleep are washing over my tired eyes. Floating in a sea of tranquility, weightless and free. Breath is like the tide, flowing in and flowing out. Deep below the surface waves, my inner ocean is silent. I release the day just as a leaf drifts down a stream. Cool, healing water soothes my nervous system. Merging into the velvet depths of rest. There is no need to swim. I simply float. The rain of relaxation washes away the dust of the day. The rain of relaxation washes away the dust of the day. The rain of relaxation washes away the dust of the day. Clear, transparent, and still. I am clear, transparent, and still. Transparent and still. My emotions are water, and I allow them to flow through me. My emotions are water, and I allow them to flow through me. emotions are water and I allow them to flow through me. I sink deeper into the stillness of the underwater world. I sink deeper into the stillness of the underwater world. Water fills a cup. Water fills a cup. Fills me like water fills a cup.